My wife was laughing, not smiling, not joking, laughing. Meanwhile, I sat quietly with a pen in my hand. A single signature separated me from the most humiliating moment of my life. I remember staring at the document, listening to the laughter. Then Simone said something that made the room laugh even harder. At least we know Malcolm isn't marrying me for my money. He'd need money first. At that moment, everyone believed they knew exactly how my future would end. Every single person in that room was wrong. I lowered the pen, took a breath, and signed. If only they knew what was already happening behind the scenes. If only I knew what was coming next. 3 weeks earlier, life had felt completely different. I was standing in the gymnasium of Booker T. Washington High School, watching my students practice for the state debate competition. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Teenagers argued passionately about economics, politics, and social issues. I smiled as I listened. Moments like these reminded me why I loved teaching. The pay wasn't impressive. The hours were long. The paperwork never seemed to end. But every year, I watched young people discover confidence they didn't know they possessed. That meant something to me. More than money ever could. Mr. Carter. I turned. Jamal rushed across the gym carrying a stack of note cards. Can you look at my opening statement? I checked my watch. My fiancée expected me downtown in 45 minutes. But Jamal looked nervous. The same nervous expression I'd seen before every major competition. I smiled. Let's hear it. For the next 20 minutes we worked through his presentation. When he finally finished, his confidence had completely changed. He stood taller, spoke stronger, believed in himself. Those moments were priceless. As I gathered my things, my phone buzzed. Simone. I answered immediately. Hey! Where are you? Her voice already sounded irritated. School. You said you'd leave 30 minutes ago. I looked toward the students still cleaning up. Jamal needed help before the competition. Silence. Then a sigh. Malcolm, sometimes I feel like your students come before everything. I rubbed my forehead. That's not true. It feels true. I'll be there soon. Another sigh. Fine. The call ended. I stared at my phone for a moment. Lately, conversations with Simone seemed to end that way. Not arguments exactly, but tension. Small frustrations. Tiny cracks appearing where there used to be none. I tried not to think about it. Every relationship had stressful periods, especially before a wedding. At least that's what I told myself. An hour later, I arrived at one of Atlanta's most expensive restaurants. Valet attendants moved luxury vehicles across the parking area. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated the dining room. A hostess escorted me toward a private table. Simone sat surrounded by friends. Designer handbag, designer watch, designer shoes. Everything about her reflected success. And honestly, I was proud of her. She had worked incredibly hard to reach her position. She deserved recognition. As I approached, Tiffany smiled. There he is. Simone looked up. Finally. I kissed her cheek. Sorry, we already ordered. I nodded. No problem. One of her co-workers laughed. Teacher schedule? Several people chuckled. I smiled politely. Something like that. The conversation quickly shifted toward business. Promotions. Investments. Stock options. Executive retreats. Corporate mergers. For nearly an hour, I barely spoke. Not because anyone intentionally excluded me, but because I had nothing meaningful to contribute. Whenever I tried joining the discussion, someone would politely redirect the conversation back toward finance. At first, Simone used to pull me into conversations. Now she seemed perfectly comfortable letting me sit quietly. The realization bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Then Tiffany asked a question. When are you guys buying a bigger house? Simone laughed. I've been asking that for months. I smiled. Our current house is fine. It's tiny. It's paid off. Tiffany nearly rolled her eyes. That's such a teacher answer. Everyone laughed again. Simone laughed too. Something about that laugh felt different. Not supportive. Not affectionate. Almost embarrassed. The feeling lingered throughout dinner. Later that night, as we drove home, I finally asked, "Do you think our house is too small?" She stared through the windshield. For us? Maybe. Why? Because we've outgrown it. She hesitated, then shrugged. I mean me. The honesty surprised both of us. The car became quiet. After a few moments, she spoke again. I just don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending money doesn't matter. I've never said that. I know. She looked toward me, but sometimes I feel like you're comfortable staying exactly where you are forever. The words weren't cruel, but they hurt, because they implied that my work lacked ambition. That teaching wasn't enough. That somehow my contribution mattered less because it generated less income. I spent most of the drive staring at the road. Neither of us spoke much after that. The following week, wedding preparations intensified. Meetings, phone calls, venue inspections, guest lists. Everything moved quickly. Then one evening, Simone brought up the prenup. We were sitting in the kitchen reviewing invitations. She cleared her throat. My attorney wants us to discuss something. I already knew. The hesitation in her voice gave it away. A prenup? She looked relieved. Yes. I nodded slowly. Okay. Okay? Why wouldn't it be okay? She stared at me. Most people get upset. I shrugged. If it makes you comfortable. She smiled. The tension immediately disappeared from her face. For a moment I was happy. Then she said something I couldn't forget. It is just smart. Especially considering the difference in our financial situations. The difference. Not our relationship. Not our future. Not our partnership. The difference. A strange choice of words. But I let it go. Because I loved her. Because weddings were stressful. Because relationships required understanding. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. 2 days later my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead I answered. Hello? Malcolm Carter? Speaking. This is Anthony Brooks. The name sounded vaguely familiar. Then I remembered. My grandfather's attorney. Anthony? Yes. His tone sounded serious. How's Grandpa? A brief silence followed. That's actually why I'm calling. My stomach tightened. What happened? Nothing immediate. The wording felt deliberate. Careful. Professional. But unsettling. I don't understand. There are estate matters we need to discuss soon. I frowned. My grandfather's estate? Correct. Is he okay? He's stable. Stable. Not healthy. Not strong. Stable. The distinction worried me, Anthony continued. Your grandfather specifically requested a meeting. About what? Another pause. Then. Your future. The words echoed in my head. My future? Yes. What does that mean? I'm afraid that discussion needs to happen in person. Before ending the call, Anthony added one final sentence. Your grandfather believes the timing is important. That conversation stayed with me for days. Yet wedding preparations consumed so much attention that I never scheduled the meeting, a decision I would soon regret. Because now I sat inside the conference room downtown. The prenup spread across the polished table. Attorneys waiting. Friends watching. Simone smiling confidently. The final document rested before me. The room felt strangely warm. The attorney pointed toward the signature line. Whenever you're ready. I picked up the pen. Then Tiffany laughed. Honestly, this is probably the easiest prenup negotiation in history. The room erupted. Someone asked why. Tiffany grinned. Because Malcolm doesn't have anything to negotiate. Even Simone laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Enough for me to notice. Enough for me to remember forever. I signed. One page. Then another. Then another. The scratching sound of the pen echoed through the room. Finally, the last signature. Done. Applause filled the conference room. Champagne glasses rose into the air. Everyone celebrated. Everyone smiled. Everyone believed the future was settled. Then my phone vibrated. I glanced down. The sender's name instantly made my stomach drop. Anthony Brooks. The message contained only one sentence. Your grandfather's condition has changed. We need to meet immediately. Suddenly the room around me disappeared. The laughter. The celebration. The champagne. None of it mattered anymore. Because for the first time, I realized something was happening behind the scenes. Something much bigger than a wedding. Much bigger than a prenup. And whatever Anthony Brooks was about to tell me had the power to change everything. I was walking through a parking garage, staring at the message on my phone. Your grandfather's condition has changed. We need to meet immediately. The words replayed in my head the entire drive. Atlanta traffic crawled around me. Car horns sounded. People rushed through crosswalks. Yet my attention remained fixed on one question. What exactly was happening? My grandfather wasn't the type of man who created drama. Elijah Carter spent most of his life avoiding attention. He hated showing off. Hated discussing money. Hated people who measured success by possessions. When I was younger, I used to think he was simply an old businessman who had done reasonably well for himself. Nothing more. I would eventually learn how wrong I was. The following morning, I drove south towards Savannah. Anthony Brooks had arranged a private meeting at a law office overlooking the river. The building itself appeared ordinary. Nothing about it suggested the conversation waiting inside would completely change how I viewed my family. Anthony greeted me personally. He was in his late 50s. Sharp suit. Calm eyes. The kind of man who spoke carefully because every word mattered. We shook hands. Thank you for coming. How's my grandfather? Anthony paused. He's stable today. The answer wasn't reassuring. He guided me into a private conference room. A thick folder sat on the table. The moment I saw it, my stomach tightened. Anthony noticed. Relax, Malcolm. I don't think I can. For the first time, he smiled. Your grandfather always said you were honest. I sat down. What is this about? Anthony opened the folder. Several photographs appeared. Old photographs. Black and white. Business meetings. Construction sites. Factories. Office buildings. I frowned. What am I looking at? Anthony folded his hands. Your grandfather's life work. For nearly an hour, he walked me through a history I had never heard. Elijah Carter had started with almost nothing. His father worked 2 jobs. His mother cleaned houses. At 22, Elijah bought a small warehouse using borrowed money. Most people believed the investment would fail. It didn't. The warehouse became 2 warehouses, then distribution centers, then commercial properties, then manufacturing partnerships, then investment firms. Decade after decade, the portfolio grew. Slowly, quietly, without media attention, without publicity, without flashy headlines. I stared at the documents. Why didn't he tell anyone? Anthony's expression softened. Because he wanted to know who loved him before they knew what he owned. The answer sounded exactly like my grandfather. Anthony continued. Most of the family knows he's comfortable. Comfortable? Anthony almost laughed. That's one way to describe it. He slid another document across the table. I looked down, then looked again. The number seemed impossible. I honestly thought I had read it incorrectly. Is this? Yes. I struggled to speak. That's worth hundreds of millions. Anthony nodded. My heart pounded. For several seconds I couldn't say anything. The figure felt unreal, like something belonging to another family, another world. Not mine. Certainly not my grandfather's. Anthony watched quietly. Finally I asked the obvious question. Why are you showing me this? The attorney leaned back. Because your grandfather asked me to. Why? Because he believes you're ready. Ready for what? Before I could ask, Anthony reached into the folder and removed a handwritten letter. The moment I saw the handwriting, I recognized it. Elijah Carter. My grandfather. Anthony slid it toward me. I unfolded the paper. The first sentence immediately brought tears to my eyes. Malcolm, if you're reading this, then life has reached one of the moments I've been preparing you for since you were a boy. I swallowed hard. Memories flooded back instantly. Summer mornings, fishing trips, long walks, conversations on the front porch. Lessons I didn't fully understand at the time. I remembered being 13 and complaining because another student had expensive shoes. My grandfather listened patiently, then asked a simple question. Do those shoes make him a better person? No. Then why are you giving them so much power? At the time I thought he was talking about shoes. Years later I realized he was talking about life, status, comparison, envy. The letter continued. Money reveals character. It does not create it. Never confuse wealth with worth. One can be bought. The other must be earned. I stared at those words for a long time, because they described everything my grandfather believed, everything he lived, everything he had spent years trying to teach me. Anthony allowed the silence to settle. Then he spoke. Your grandfather has watched your life closely. I looked up. What do you mean? He knows about your teaching. He does? Anthony smiled. He knows about the students you've helped, the scholarships you've funded anonymously, the families you've assisted. I blinked. How? Because he asked. Suddenly dozens of moments made sense. Unexpected questions. Random phone calls. Conversations that seemed casual at the time. My grandfather had been paying attention all along, not to my income, not to my career title, to my character. Anthony continued. Several family members assumed they would inherit the majority of the estate. I remained silent. Their assumption was based on blood. His eyes locked onto mine. Your grandfather based his decision on values. The weight of those words settled heavily inside me. Outside the conference room window, boats moved slowly across the river. Inside, my future was quietly being rewritten. Yet the strangest part was that I didn't feel excitement. I felt responsibility. A massive responsibility. As the meeting ended, Anthony handed me another folder. Keep this private. I will. For now, only 3 people know the full picture. I nodded. Then paused. Comma. Does Simone know anything about this? Anthony's answer was immediate. No. The drive back to Atlanta felt surreal. Meanwhile, wedding planning continued. Simone remained focused on venues, guest lists, and appearances. But something else was changing too. Small comments became more frequent, more pointed, more revealing. One evening she attended a corporate networking event. When she returned home, she seemed unusually excited. The keynote speaker made $40 million from one acquisition. I smiled. That's impressive. It really is. She paused. Comma. Then added, sometimes I wonder what life would look like if you had gone into business. The comment sounded harmless, but it lingered. Because she wasn't asking, she was comparing. And over the following weeks, the comparisons became increasingly common. Wealthy executives, successful founders, investors, people with private jets, people with luxury homes, people with titles. Meanwhile, I remained exactly who I had always been. A teacher, a mentor, a husband --b. Comma. A man my grandfather believed was ready for something far bigger than himself. Then one rainy evening my phone rang. Anthony Brooks. I answered immediately. Anthony? His voice sounded different, more serious, more urgent. I stood from the couch. What happened? A long silence followed. Then he spoke. Malcolm. My heart immediately accelerated. Your grandfather's condition has suddenly worsened. I closed my eyes. The room seemed to spin. And before I could say another word, Anthony added something that made my stomach drop. We need to accelerate everything. The weeks following, Anthony's phone call became some of the most confusing of my life. On one side, my grandfather's health was declining. On the other, my marriage was slowly changing into something I barely recognized. Neither crisis happened overnight. That was the painful part. Most people imagine relationships collapse because of one betrayal, one argument, one dramatic event. The truth is often quieter. A relationship can die one small disappointment at a time, one comparison, one dismissal, one moment of disrespect, until eventually 2 people wake up and realize they're no longer standing on the same road. 3 months after the wedding, Simone received another promotion. The announcement came during a company gala attended by hundreds of executives. I sat proudly at our table while her CEO praised her achievements. The room erupted with applause. I stood and applauded louder than anyone, because despite everything, I genuinely wanted her to succeed. She had worked hard. She deserved recognition. That night she received a compensation package larger than my annual salary. The promotion changed everything. At first, the changes seemed small. More business trips, more networking events, more late-night meetings. Then came the subtle comments, the comparisons, the looks. One evening we attended a corporate dinner at an upscale restaurant. Most of the guests were executives, investors, entrepreneurs, people whose lives revolved around money. A man sitting beside Simone asked what I did. I'm a teacher. His smile became polite. The kind of smile people use when they're no longer interested. Oh! Then he immediately returned to discussing investments with Simone. For the rest of the evening I barely existed. The strange part wasn't his reaction. It was Simone's. She didn't defend me, didn't include me, didn't mention my accomplishments. Instead, she seemed relieved whenever the conversation moved away from me. The realization stayed with me during the drive home. A week later, things became worse. Simone invited several colleagues to our house. The conversation eventually turned toward career growth. One executive asked whether I had ever considered leaving education. Before I could answer, Simone laughed. "Trust me, I've tried." The room chuckled. I forced a smile. The executive grinned. "So he's one of those people who teaches because he loves it." Exactly. More laughter. Then Simone added something that hit harder than she realized. "Some people are motivated by purpose." She paused. "And some people are motivated by success." The room laughed again. I didn't, because for the first time, I understood what she was really saying. She no longer viewed those things as the same. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat alone in the living room staring at the darkness. Eventually Simone walked downstairs. "Why are you awake?" I looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are you embarrassed by me?" Her expression changed instantly. "What?" "You heard me." She crossed her arms. "Where is this coming from? Just answer." Several seconds passed. Then she sighed. "Malcolm, that's not fair. That's not an answer." The silence that followed told me everything. She wasn't embarrassed by who I was. She was embarrassed by what I wasn't. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't influential. I wasn't impressive to her colleagues. For the first time in our relationship, I felt completely alone. Meanwhile, Anthony continued updating me about my grandfather. Each report sounded worse than the last. Elijah spent more time in bed, more time receiving treatment, more time resting. Yet every conversation ended the same way. He asked about my students, my marriage, my life. Never money, never business. Even now, he remained focused on character. One afternoon, I visited him personally. He looked weaker than I had ever seen, but his eyes remained sharp. As I sat beside his bed, he smiled. "You look tired." I laughed softly. I could say the same thing. He chuckled. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Then suddenly, he became serious. "Malcolm." "Yes." "Never allow money to tell you who deserves respect." I stared at him. The words felt strangely specific, almost deliberate, like he knew something I hadn't yet admitted. He reached for my hand. "People reveal themselves when they think wealth makes them important." I swallowed hard, because deep down, I knew exactly who he was talking about. Before leaving, I hugged him longer than usual. Something inside me feared it might be the last time. 3 days later, Anthony called again. It was nearly midnight. The moment I saw his name, my stomach tightened. I answered immediately. "Anthony?" His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that only appears before life changes forever. I stood from the couch, my heart pounding. "What happened?" Several seconds passed. Then he finally spoke. "Malcolm." I gripped the phone tighter. "The documents are complete." My pulse accelerated. "What does that mean?" Another pause. Then the words that changed everything. "It's time." The call came at 5:12 the following morning. I knew what it meant before I answered. Nobody calls at that hour to deliver good news. I sat upright in bed and answered immediately. "Anthony." A long silence followed. Then came the words I had been dreading for months. Elijah passed away peacefully during the night. My eyes closed. For several seconds I couldn't speak. The room felt strangely quiet, almost frozen. My grandfather had prepared me for this moment. Anthony had prepared me for this moment. Yet nothing truly prepares you for losing someone who helped shape your entire life. After ending the call, I sat alone in the darkness, remembering fishing trips, long conversations, life lessons, the way he always listened more than he spoke, the way he treated janitors and CEOs with exactly the same respect, the way he never allowed money to determine a person's value. 3 days later, the family gathered inside a private conference room overlooking Savannah Harbor. The atmosphere felt heavy, somber, formal. Anthony Brooks stood at the head of the table. Stacks of documents rested neatly before him. Several relatives occupied seats around the room. Some looked sad. Others looked nervous. A few looked hopeful. Simone sat beside me wearing a black dress. She squeezed my hand. For the first time in months, she seemed genuinely supportive. The room eventually fell silent. Anthony opened the first folder. "Thank you all for attending." His voice echoed softly. "We are here to review the final wishes of Elijah Carter." The legal process began. Personal items were distributed. Charitable donations were announced. Family gifts were discussed. Everything appeared ordinary. Then Anthony opened a second binder. The room immediately became quieter. I recognized the binder. It was one of the documents he had shown me months earlier. Anthony adjusted his glasses. There is one final matter. Every eye in the room shifted toward him, Anthony continued. Over the course of his life, Elijah Carter accumulated a substantial collection of assets. Several relatives leaned forward. I noticed it instantly. Karma. The anticipation, the expectation, the assumptions. Anthony opened the binder, then began reading. Commercial real estate holdings, private investment partnerships, distribution centers, manufacturing interests, long-term stock portfolios, trust assets. The list seemed endless. Murmurs spread across the room. People exchanged confused glances. Most had no idea the estate was this large. Neither did Simone. I could see it on her face. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Anthony continued reading. Numbers followed. Large numbers. Then larger numbers. The room became completely silent. Finally, Anthony reached the conclusion. The estimated value of the estate currently exceeds $200 million. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was absolute. One relative actually dropped a pen. Another simply stared at the documents. Simone looked frozen. Completely frozen. Anthony calmly turned another page, then delivered the sentence that changed everything, in accordance with Elijah Carter's final instructions. Controlling ownership of these assets will transfer to Malcolm Elijah Carter. Several people gasped. Simone's head snapped toward me. Her eyes widened. For a moment she looked like she had stopped breathing. Anthony continued speaking, but I barely heard him, because all I could think about was my grandfather, not the money, not the assets, not the businesses. Him. His trust. His belief in me. His decision. The room remained stunned. Eventually Anthony finished reading. No dramatic music. No celebration. No applause. Just silence. Heavy silence. Simone stared at me. Then at the documents. Then back at me. I could almost see the realization forming inside her mind. The prenup. The document she had celebrated. The document she insisted upon. The document that separated our assets. It now applied to me, not just to her. For years she had viewed the agreement as protection from someone with less. Now it protected someone with more. The irony was impossible to ignore. Yet strangely I felt no satisfaction. No revenge. No triumph. Only sadness. Because none of this should have mattered. Not if love had remained stronger than status. Not if respect had remained stronger than income. After the meeting ended, people slowly began leaving. Eventually only Simone and I remained near the harbor. The sun reflected across the water. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally she broke the silence. You knew, I nodded. Not everything, but some of it. Yes. She stared toward the water. Why didn't you tell me? The answer came easily. Because it never felt important. She laughed softly. Except this time there was no arrogance behind it. Only regret. A deep regret. I spent years measuring people by the wrong things. I didn't answer, because she already knew. We both did. The real tragedy wasn't that she underestimated my future wealth. The real tragedy was that she underestimated my value long before any money entered the picture. As the sun began disappearing beyond the harbor, I remembered something my grandfather once told me. A lesson that suddenly felt more important than $200 million. He said, character is who you are when nobody sees your potential. Not when you're successful. Not when you're powerful. Not when you're rich. Before all of that, when the world thinks you're ordinary, that's when character matters most. And standing there beside the harbor, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The greatest mistake in life is not being poor,